Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist. Today I'm finally ready to bring you my first book review from this kids horror series called Terror Valley. Now this series is a Goosebumps throwback series. It's come out in recent years, and I think currently it's on its third installment, about to be on its fourth, and it's written by an author named Squall Charlson. Now from what I've gathered about the author, from what I've been able to see on interviews, on YouTube and what have you, he seems like a very knowledgeable and forthright kind of person. And I'm glad that he's, putting out a series and putting his own stamp on the subgenre. And he was actually kind enough to reach out to me on Twitter. I believe it was him or maybe his publicist. I don't know. Whoever runs the Terror Valley Twitter page sent me a free ebook copy of this book I'm reviewing today because I shouted them out on Twitter and I guess, spread awareness about them. And I thought that was really kind of them to do so. So I actually read the book and I'm glad to have read it. And I went ahead and I bought a physical copy for you guys for the thumbnail purpose and just for my collection to support Squall Charlson and everything that he's doing over here at Terror Valley. And we're actually going to be looking at book number 3 for this review, which is called This Way to Camp Blood. Now, when Terror Valley first dropped, I was super excited to have another Goosebumps throwback in the mix in kids horror. And a lot of these series you can find on Amazon. And these are, passionate about the subgenre people trying to put out content and make a name for themselves and trying to stand out in the crowd next to pretty much a burgeoning subgenre led by two powerhouses, Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps. I get the struggles for these smaller authors out there, and I really do wish that the subgenre was bigger and popular like it was back in the heyday for these types of series to, be a little more successful than they currently are and what have you. But that's a whole different topic. I was jonesed nonetheless to see that this series existed, and I bought the first 2 books I think a year or 2 ago now, and I'm saddened to say I haven't gotten around to reading those, but I'm glad I started with this one because this one actually piqued my interest the most. When I saw this book was coming out and I saw the cover art, I was blown away, and I was like, oh boy, we got a kids horror book centered around a slasher movie. And hearing about the synopsis, I was looking forward to this book tremendously. After reading it, I can say this up front. This was a breath of fresh air. I've never read anything like this in kids horror, and I mean that. That's a genuine compliment about this book. And off the bat, I would highly recommend to all of you out there, especially if you're just a fan of the kids horror subgenre and you're looking for something different, try this book out. There's a lot of surprises in here that you wouldn't expect going into it. So yeah, it gets my recommendation. Go out and buy this, maybe on ebook or physical for your collection, and see if you would like this book or maybe like this series and might try more. So with that being out the way, I'm going to get into the plot overview. Try not to give too much away, but I will get into some spoilers in the story, okay, at points. So what is this book about? Well, it's about this 13-year-old kid named Alejandro who goes by Al. Or Ale, I don't know how you really say that. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I'm assuming it's Al because it's spelled A-L-E. But besides the point, he is a horror aficionado. More specifically, he's a massive fan of the 6-movie franchise known as Blood Lake, or whatever it's called, the Blood Lake Massacre. I forget what it's called, but it's basically a in-universe spoof of the Friday the 13th movies, which exist in our universe. And in this book, this kid, he's obsessed with these 6 movies, and he's grown up on these films because he's been raised by his uncle since the age of 5 when his single mother passed away due to unforeseen circumstances. And one of the first things he ever did with his uncle to bond with him was to watch these movies. And for the past 8 years of his life, he's become a massive fan. His uncle is an even bigger fan of the horror genre as a whole, but they both love or are obsessed with these movies. And it comes to a point where Al is telling the readers that there's a contest coming up for a 7th installment to this franchise that hasn't had an installment since the 1980s. And back in the day, as the story lays out to you, the 5th and 6th movies kind of tanked all fan support and pretty much killed the steam of the franchise and stopped it from happening anymore. Well, now there's going to be a 7th installment, and they're not going the reboot route. They're actually just going to make a straight up another sequel set in the same camp and pick up where they left off without having to reboot the whole thing. And Al seems to be really excited for this, but there's a contest involved from the producers that is put out, and it's made aware to him by his uncle, who has been, sent this message on this forum that he runs on this horror fan page, that is an invitation from the producers to put out audition tapes. And there's going to be a contest winner, and whoever wins gets to actually have a walk-on role for the film and be a part of the main cast, who I think is 5 characters, and maybe 6 from memory. I can't really remember, but they essentially get to be a part of the movie and live their dream and be a part of this franchise. Well, Al and his uncle submit their own tapes, and it turns out that Al is actually hand-selected to be the winner. And the producers essentially invite him out and his uncle, because his uncle is his guardian, and since it's child labor involved with him being 13, he kind of has to come along. And they go out to this place in the country where they're met by this man named Maynard. And Maynard's going to drive them up to the location, which is about 2 to 3 hours away, deep out in the middle of the woods somewhere. And Maynard, off the bat, kind of makes his point clear that he has a strong disdain for fans and who he calls fangirls, who just are annoying to him. But he will be working on the movie, as you'll find out later in the book. And he takes Al and his uncle Jose to this location, and the both of them are just mesmerized that they're actually on set where all these movies took place, and it's making like their inner nerd just come out, right? And they're excited and exuberant about it. But when they arrive there, they of course are introduced to a huge cast of people, and there's so many names to remember. I apologize if I butcher any of them, but he meets the director, the producers, the assistant director, and some fellow castmates. And almost immediately, Al is taken into a room, I guess, to practice their lines and maybe go over what's to be expected of them while they're going to be filming this movie. And there we meet some other characters. There's this one guy who's like this pompous actor guy who has a lot of roles already, and he's easily the most experienced. I think his name is Gio. He's like the resident jerk of the group, who tries to be fake nice to everyone. You have this girl named Mia, who is more down to earth and excited to get a breakout role. And I think another guy named Brent was also in the same boat with that. But then there's this girl, and I forget her name. I'm just going to pull up her name real quick. I want to say her name is Bella. Bella is very familiar to Al and Jose. And the more they look at her, they realize that she's like this YouTuber who's a critic reviewer. And supposedly she has horrible takes about horror movies, and she has routinely bashed this franchise that Al and his uncle really love. And she seems to have takes where she likes super unpopular movies and dislikes popular ones. She's that type of person, right? Just the inversion of, I guess, the mainstream. And she's not liked online whatsoever, especially in the horror forums. Well, anyway, when they learn, their cast, and they start reading and they realize like how much lines are going to be given, the producers and the director come in and essentially walk them through that because a lot of them aren't experienced, they're going to be kind of winging this movie a little bit, and they're given like side cards to try to remember and to make it as simple as possible. And early scenes, they're shooting early scenes where, you have these characters intermingling and what have you. And there's even this woman named Shelley, who I guess is supposed to be a nod to the character Shelley from Friday the 13th Part 3. I don't know, but I would guess so. She's like this documentarian also in the mix, kind of filming behind the scenes footage for the making of documentary that's going to be put on the DVD and Blu-ray of the movie. Well, anyways, after filming the first few scenes, it's revealed that they're going to have to start filming some kill sequences. And turns out that Al's uncle, Jose, is being picked to be the first one. Now, unfortunately for Al, who wants to stay behind and watch this kill scene actually happen behind the scenes, there's some snags in getting this all prepared, and he's not able to actually watch the scene happen. And he has to go to bed and go back to his cabin because they don't need all these people on set. They need it, I guess, more expansive in the area to work with to shoot the scene that involves a bus and a cliffside, I think. So, Al goes off and goes to sleep and doesn't think anything about it until the next morning when he wakes up and notices that his uncle has disappeared. He never came back from the night before, and all of his stuff is missing out of the cabin. So when he goes to, ask some people, hey, have you seen my uncle? They essentially tell him that, he had to go back to the city and go back to work. But unbeknownst to them, they didn't know that his uncle had brought his work laptop with him to work on his stuff out here in the country. And the workers are like, oh, well, yeah, he mentioned that, but he needed some internet connection, right? And we don't have it out here. So this starts to ring some bells and worry in Al's head. Now, you would think that Al would be like, okay, well, I got to figure out what happened to my uncle and dig more deeper into it. But because he's on this larger-than-life movie set that he's always wanting to be on, he tries to pursue through it. But things get weird almost immediately after that. The YouTuber that nobody likes named Bella, it's her turn to film a scene that she's supposed to die in, and she gives some lip to the director about the direction that they're going, right? And she essentially tries to walk off set, and we later find out that perhaps that is the case because she turns up to be missing, and everybody seems to think that she went back to their city on her own accord. And because of that, now they have to kind of reshoot a brand new scene improv style to go over, some loose ends with her character because she essentially is going to be missing out of the movie now. So they shoot this improv scene, and this impresses the directors because Al is able to be witty and in the moment, and because of his knowledge of the franchise, it's actually helping the movie production and the creators of it immensely. So Al starts to earn some favor. And we see this when it's revealed that the next person who's going to die in the movie is actually this guy named Brent. And it's going to involve a boat propeller, let's just say. And as per usual, he ends up going missing. And nobody really knows what to think of it, right? Now that 3 people have gone missing after their supposed death scenes, Al starts to look into things a little more and wants to essentially get some help in finding some answers. And I believe him and this woman named Shelley, who's this documentarian, are out exploring the nearby area one day, and they find this cave. And this cave has some mysterious origins behind it. They don't know why it's there. They've never seen it before. It looks like it might have been fabricated or might be natural. They can't really decide. But there's some suspicious things going on in there with some of the film's crew. So they file that in the back of their mind, and they keep that information, kind of lock and key. But it comes to a point where Al realizes that it's his turn to die in the script, and his time essentially is going to be over living this dream, because for everyone else, when it's their turn to die, they end up having to leave and go back to the city. And he feels like, well, his time is up, and he's made it as far in the movie that he's going to be able to make it into. And there's this whole thing where he's telling the reader in his monologue how cool he thinks it would be if he got to be one of the last remaining characters in the movie. And not necessarily like the final kid, because he thinks in slasher movies they need to be final girls. But as long as they took a different direction with it, he'd be cool with it. Now it comes to a point where he's supposed to die in an explosion in a cabin. And he's talking to the producer, who is telling him, saying that, we might switch you and this girl, Mia, and Mia's going to die in the explosion. He's like, well, maybe instead of doing that, right, why don't we just have everybody die at the end, right? And they're like, oh, this is a good idea. So they're starting to, shake up the idea a little bit and kind of do some more improv stuff on the fly. But this is where the story kind of changes, right? And we start actually getting into the mystery and the whereabouts of what happened to these people. And it all starts when Shelley, who we last saw was gathering information about the cave, did some more spying on her own and figured out that there's possibly people inside of this cave. And it turns out that these actors who have, been told that they went back to the city are actually tied up in this cave somewhere. And this, of course, makes Al, paranoid and panicked. And this also causes some tension, which is going under the surface here with this guy named Geo, who is trying to be fake nice to everyone, but at a certain point, he kind of shows his true colors, and, he even punches Al in the stomach for him not to get in his way, because he's here to be the star of the show, essentially. And it turns out that there's an aspect to the story that I haven't touched on, right? But this all comes ahead more so in this back portion, so I guess I'll touch on it now. There's an urban legend surrounding the movies itself, and it perhaps is tied to a real-life serial killer that killed people about 2 miles away from the actual setting that they're shooting at. And supposedly, according to the rumor mills that some internet fan speculations have gathered up over the years, is that the weapon used in the movies is actually the same weapon that the real life killer used, and then perhaps has supernatural abilities. And the second thing is that some of the kills featured in these movies are perhaps real deaths, right? And now that you know that, it comes to a point where there's essentially a deus ex machina for the audience to realize about the crew, exactly what they're doing here, and it all involves in the context of how they're making the movie and how authentic it is, and it's rooted in this motive of it being for, fans that are just insatiated by bloodlust and the realism and how it looks and how fans are always obsessing over that it's caused this director, who's recontextualized to be another character in the story that I haven't touched on, and I'm not going to. You'll find that out for yourself, which I thought was kind of a cool twist, into being his motive of like why he's doing it the way he is, essentially, right? This comes to fold in the climax of the story once Al realizes that the stuff has hit the fan, essentially, that he has to now save all the other actors that are currently around, and they're going to have to find a way to go save everybody else that's tied up in the cave. But because of the whole machete legend thing that's going on, that's brought into the forefront, and the director essentially reveals that he needs a killer for the movie. And whoever steps up is going to get paid to do it. And this causes a scuffle between Al and this guy Geo, and Geo perhaps picks up this machete. And as we saw with Al, who possibly had a taste of it beforehand, it does something to your body and changes you into perhaps whatever this thing is here. And it does this effect to Geo, and Al and Mia essentially make a break for it and run away from the camera crew, and they're running across the entire film set. And as they're running, they end up finding that the people in the cave have been transported to these scenes, like Bella, who is the YouTuber girl that nobody likes. She's geared up for a scene that's supposed to match the death that was originally planned for her in the script. Same thing with the other guy, Brent. And eventually they realize that there's a school bus that they're missing, because that's where Al's uncle disappeared, was with a school bus scene. And they find it on top of this cliffside, and of course, Uncle Jose is in there, tied up, and Al ends up trying to be the hero there. But the killer follows him to the school bus, and then Al has to make a decision involving the machete that the killer's holding to perhaps try to conquer whatever's cursing it to save the day. But in doing so, he gets an answer to another thing that I haven't touched on at all because it doesn't really play an important role to this point, about a missing original actor who played the killer once upon a time that went uncredited in the movies. Finding some answers about that in a weird way, I would say. But through that, Al is able to communicate with this said person and figure out a possible way to kind of conquer this urge within this cursed machete, and perhaps helps put a stop to the events once and for all. And I'll just leave it there. And then the ending involves all the actors possibly getting a way out and leaving the film set. But there is some stuff there that might still be lingering, and some unanswered things that we don't get to see as a follow-up to what's going to happen to the actors moving forward, or even the camera crew for attempting what they did. But nonetheless, that's what you're going to expect out of this book here. Now, this review sounded a little all over the place because there's so much details in this book that if I got into too much of it, we'd be here for an hour. This book is very dense. It's like 188 pages, I think. It's like 50-something chapters. There's a lot of information cramped into this book here. So much so that I tried to cover it as best as I could. And I'm sorry if I got some things confused here and there, but I don't think I did. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this book. So off the bat, I guess I'll start with positives, right? One thing I think this book does exceptionally well over a lot of kids' horror out there is the character writing, and I'm talking specifically the monologue. I think Al's monologue in this story is incredible. How detailed he is, and how much of his personality oozes on page, of him being a horror fan and him being witty and snarky and kind of street smart. It was very entertaining to read. And that goes to say, even the side characters here were very entertaining. They all had their own distinct personalities. And there's some funny jokes at the expense of horror fandom in the mix of that as well. And kind of making some observations about like horror opinion and criticism in the mix. I don't know if that was self-insert stuff from Squall Charleston here, but I kind of like that it was there. It kind of helped it make it seem more relevant and kind of niche for somebody like myself to identify with, because I totally see what this book is saying. And I thought it was super entertaining. The characters in this book, I thought the character writing as a whole was probably one of the biggest strengths that Squall Charleston brought to the table as an author. I can definitely tell he's not really a prose writer like majority of kids' horror writers. He's very character focused, which isn't a bad thing. I think he paints a story in a very unique voice. He paints it with characters. He paints it with dialogue. He paints it with taking methodical time and building up expository scenes, and bridging the gap between those and scenes to kind of carry along the tension or carry along the mystery. I just think it's a very unique way that he laid out this book, and you don't see this often in kids' horror. But the closest thing I can tell you that this feels like, it feels like some authors that I've read in a long since dead series from the 90s called Spine Tinglers. Honestly, if this was like an entry in that series, I would believe it, because those books are also dense and written in a similar way. And I'm not saying that dense books are bad by any means, but this book it feels dense because of just countless character dialogue moments going on, which isn't bad. If you're not used to that, I can see that being a negative for you. But like I said, it just felt refreshing to read a story like this. And I think a lot of it has to deal with the characters, right? And in terms of the premise itself, I like that we're going this whole, fan wanting to be a part of their favorite franchise thing. I think that's a very cool setup to a story. And it being centered around like this urban legend of some uncertainty about the killer's origins, perhaps the machete, the killer's weapon, and all of that. I think that's a really cool concept, and we see that come to fruition by the end of the book and like the final act, or maybe the final fourth of the book. And I thought that was some really cool, inventive ways of doing a slasher villain or even monster in a kid's horror book. So, yeah, some really solid concepts here. And for the most part, I will say this, one last big positive I could say about the book is that I didn't get bored while reading this. There's not a dull moment in this book. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very, very exceptional written book. But I do have some problems with it. And I'm going to be upfront. And I'm not trying to be mean to Squall Charleston at all. I'm just talking about the product here. For me, there's not enough action in the book. There's just not enough. There's too much off-screen things happening to kind of, bleed into the mystery of it, which I don't mind. But the book doesn't spend a lot of time on the mystery at all. As a matter of fact, when we get introduced to the mystery, especially when it starts with Uncle Jose, that's not really the focal point for majority of the book. It kind of has to redirect to that by the back portion of it. And I'm talking later part of Act 3, beginning of Act 4. Majority of the book is just them going through the motions and, reading sidelines and, painting scenes of them doing an impromptu scene and, speculating on who's going to die next, stuff like that. That's just, I don't feel like that's how the book should have been presented, right? You could have cut out probably 10 chapters of that and been just fine. And honestly, the second thing I could kind of point out that I was kind of bummed about was the mention of the main character Al's mom being also a fan of these movies, and how part of the reason why he wants to do this is to not only be a part of his favorite franchise, but also kind of see bits of his mom, who he doesn't really have tangible memories of, because he lost her when he was at such a young age. And I thought that was going to play a more important role in the back half of the story. As a matter of fact, there's a part near the end involving the machete when Al takes it over and meets this character. No, I don't want to spoil it. But I thought that was going to tie symmetrically to how he feels about his mother, given what we got with that character. But it just didn't happen, right? And it felt like the story could have had some extra substance cooking in there that it just wasn't capitalized on. And that was kind of a bummer. And the last thing I can kind of say about the book for me, in terms of negatives, is that I don't know how to put this without sounding kind of brash about it, but I will say this. Some of the characters felt very heavy-handed, and I'm not trying to say that it's necessarily a bad thing, because I thought the characters were entertaining for the most part, but specifically with certain characters like Bella and Al, and how Al views Bella, right, is entertaining because it feels authentic, and how like a fanboy of Friday the 13th movies, for example, would hate a critic who hates the Friday the 13th movies if they were put in the same room, right? But there's some like dialogue in here that feels kind of self-inserty about opinions on what makes a good horror movie. And we're getting down into the line of Al being hyper-focused on the look of a killer's outfit, the use of practical blood and CGI and all of this. And it feels like classic slasher fanboy mentality stuff, which is kind of a running gag online already. Like, I don't think people actually realize that this stuff is kind of made fun of. And it came off kind of cringy at moments with Al's character, where he just seemed like so in over his head and kind of into himself with his opinions about this stuff that it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way at times. And like I said, I don't know if that was supposed to be Al's character or if that's actually just what the author feels, because this is a very niche specific kind of book. Like, I feel like you have to be a slasher fan or just a horror movie fan and be involved in the critic review circle or some sort of content creating circle to understand what this book is talking about in certain levels of it involving that. But like I said, it just feels kind of heavy-handed and kind of slighted, and the lack of awareness there for his character is also, not helping it. But that's more of a smaller thing compared to some other things here. But nonetheless, I thought that this book was pretty exceptional. I've been here for almost 30 minutes talking about a book that a lot of you haven't heard of before, but I had a blast with this book. It wasn't the best thing ever, but it definitely opened my eyes to this series, and I'm glad to check out more. If I had to rate this book from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'm going to be honest, those issues that I had with the book did kind of add up, specifically the first one about it just not having enough action, not being focused on the mystery enough, and having some missed opportunities to have more substance to it at times. Those did kind of weigh down the book for me to maybe like a B tier, but given some things about some of the heavy-handed stuff as well, that kind of tacked it on to the C tier. But don't take me saying that this book is a C tier as a knock to it. I think a C tier book is a good book. I'd probably give this book maybe like a 3.8 out of 5 stars. And I only deducted 1.2 off the top for those 3 issues mainly. But those were kind of medium ones that did add up over time, sadly. But I would still recommend it. You know what I mean? I would still recommend that you go buy this book and check it out. You might love this more than I did, and I wouldn't blame you. I think people should go support Squall Charlson in this series, Terror Valley. Like I said, this is the 3rd book currently out. I think, is a 4th book coming out, and it's called, let me see here. It's in the back of the book here. Fear the Frostbiters, which sounds like an intriguing title. It might be snow-themed, which is really cool. I'm excited to see that. And I think the other 2 books out before this one is School's Out Forever or For Never or something like that. And the other one is You're Not My Sensei. So, yeah. Out there titles, out there covers, but they definitely help sell the books. And, yeah, you definitely have a customer for me here. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on Terror Valley's This Way to Camp Blood. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Did you love it? Did you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.